For the world to work, the G20 must succeed. Coordinating the world's 20 largest economies is no mean task. The job gets harder when geopolitical crises interfere. The theme of G20 2017 in Hamburg, Germany is a world interconnected, and my interest is China's growing role in global governance. How did China transform from suspicious of globalization to champion of globalization? How does China benefit from globalization? What can China contribute? What ideas does it have? What responsibilities will it have? What burdens must it bear? What risks lie ahead? Assessing China's global vision takes us closer to China.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with foreign leaders on the sidelines of the ongoing G20 summit. China's president discussed the Paris Climate Agreement and desire to work on joint renewable energy projects with these counterparts. China agreed to promote bilateral relations and cooperation. The group of 20 leaders have reached compromises on trade by recognizing both free trade and certain forms of protectionism. Leaders from G20 countries said they plan to continue the fight against protectionism, including all unfair trade practices, but also acknowledged the role of legitimate defense instruments in trade. China's participation in the G20 demonstrated the country's continuing effort to participate in global governance. But is the country ready?
To appreciate China's role in the G20 and in global governance, I speak with two thought leaders. Professor Hu Anggang is Dean of the Institute for Contemporary China Studies at Tsinghua University. Tianwei Feng is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of World Economics and Politics at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Hu, everybody is talking about globalization and anti-globalization in certain countries, and in this time we see China taking a unique role in globalization, which is surprising many people. Maybe it's concerning many people in the world. China talks, and you've been one of the pioneers in talking about a new kind of globalization. What is China's vision of a new kind of globalization?
可以说，因为以往的全球化呢，它是不公平的。
We can say this new globalization is targeted at the anti-globalization trend today. Actually, the core of the new globalization is President Xi's three key words. First, it is more robust. Second, it is more inclusive. Third, it is more sustainable. Or, as we call it, greener. For sure, we hope this new globalization would be different from that of earlier times. The traditional globalization is unfair, partial, and not sustainable. So actually today we are not discussing whether to continue globalization or not. What we are talking about is how to guarantee that the globalization we have today is robust and innovative.
During the early decades of the People's Republic, China was completely closed. And then in the subsequent decades, China, I guess, was suspicious of globalization, as if it were maybe a Western plot to change China's domestic politics or structure. But we've seen in recent years this transformation from China being suspicious of globalization to China being a champion of globalization. That has surprised many people. I don't think it surprised you.
可以说世界曾经历过几次
We can say that the world has gone through several globalization phases. For instance, the first phase was between 1870 and 1913. During this phase, China was totally marginalized and were left behind. The second globalization phase was after the World War II, from 1950 to 1973, during which the annual trade growth exceeded 7%. However, in this phase, China was still an outsider. Then after 1990, as China adopted the opening up and reform policy, China was not only a newcomer, but also the biggest beneficiary. From 1990 to 2008, global trade growth rate was around 8 to 9%, while China's trade growth rate was twice the global trade growth rate. But after the financial crisis, we saw this new trend of anti-globalization. Of course, China was also a major victim back then, so the global financial crisis was a turning point. After the crisis, the growth of global trade was never able to reach that of the economic growth. As for China, the proportion of trade in GDP has been growing continuously, but it peaked in 2006 and went down, which explains why China would play a major role in pushing a new globalization forward. The reason for China to play a bigger role in globalization was also that we are a major economy now. We're the biggest economy. And among about 140 countries or regions, China is the biggest trade partner of more than 120. It is estimated by 2020, China will be the biggest trade partner of more than 140 or even 150 countries or regions. Today we're the biggest trade partner of the US, which was out of our expectations. Therefore, as the biggest stakeholder, China would try its best to uphold and push forward this ongoing globalization. And we must also make sure that it transforms from the traditional to the new one. To achieve this, we must adopt the win-win approach that President Xi brought up.
Many times, Chinese experts from China or officials talk about the benefits that globalization will bring to other countries because that's their interest. I like to start the other way. I like to talk with the benefits to China because there are, President Xi talks about win-win, and so to win-win, both sides have to win. So let's just articulate the benefits of globalization to China in both historically, which has led to the Chinese, the great Chinese miracle of economic development, and also going forward where there needs to be this new kind of globalization that you talked about with President Xi's 3 points.
I think after China became the biggest trade body, President Xi has brought about this Xi policy, or win-winism. Back to the history of more than 5 centuries, we had colonialism, imperialism, and hegemonyism after the Second World War. As China steps onto the center of the world stage, we must have our own way of win-winism. Because fundamentally, win-winism is different from the old zero-sum game in that it is respectable, exchangeable, and sustainable. This is why we think this win-winism by President Xi should be the soul and spirit of the new globalization. At the same time, he had not only brought up win-winism, but he also proposed a plan, namely the Belt and Road Initiative. The essence of the initiative is actually to help all countries better develop themselves and boost the world economy as a whole through increasing connectivity. The spillover effect of China's economic growth is our contribution to the growth of the world economy, trade, and tourism, as China has become the biggest tourist exporter. In terms of investment, China has become the 2nd largest investor overseas, and probably soon would exceed the US and become the biggest global investor. Moreover, China has also been a major contributor of innovation. After the global financial crisis, most countries cut their budget on research and development, while China, on the contrary, greatly increased its investment. As a result, China also became the #1 invention patent applicant and beneficiary. In the future, we hope to become the #2 or even #1 country in terms of PCT, as we are right now #3, in order to make the several global contributions we talked about previously.
I think through connecting the countries along the route, one major contribution would be that there would be less barriers and less cost for doing trade and investment. Moreover, this would help include these countries in globalization and bring about cultural exchanges. All these are the concrete benefits the initiative can bring to the countries along the route. And most importantly, as the development of the countries along the route are connected, the scale effect would be significant. And now we want to implement the 2030 Development Plan. We can see the Belt and Road Initiative shares a lot in common with the 2030 Development Plan. Thus, the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative would also help in regional development goals and the country's domestic development goals to be realized by 2030.
We'll be right back. Professor Hu, some critics charge China with hypocrisy in claiming to be the champion of globalization because China's own markets have been more restricted and more protected than most other countries in the world. How do you react to that?
This is because of their lack of understanding. expanding. It's only been about 40 years since China's reform and opening up. However, China's total trade volume has increased from the original less than 1% of the world's total to the current 13 to 14%. So we have opened up the Chinese market to the world. Looking to the future, according to our calculation, China has astounding prospects. I can offer many lists for your information. For instance, in the next 5 years, China's total import revenue will reach 1.6 to 1.8 or even 2 trillion US dollars. This is our estimate on an annual basis. The second list of data is about the revenue of contracts. The figure could reach 180 to 200 billion US dollars. What does it mean? Well, China will help the world with an infrastructure development. This demonstrates the advancement of China's technologies and equipment as well as high standards. It is especially true for southern countries, not to mention Western countries like the US or European countries. The third list of figures that amazes us is the number of Chinese tourists to foreign countries. According to our estimates, more than 140 million to 170 million Chinese people traveling abroad every year. How should we understand this? Well, generally, every year our outbound tourists contribute about 110 billion to 130 billion US dollars to their destinations around the world, which cover more than 230 different countries and regions. Last but not least, China will help its students go abroad. Actually, Chinese students studying abroad have already become the largest group of inbound foreigners in America, Europe, etc. From China's perspective, we're gradually lowering our tariff. As a matter of fact, China has adopted a zero-tariff treatment to more than 40 least developed countries in the world. In the future, we will continue to expand the coverage. In addition to that, China has to promote the unification of the domestic market and remove trade barriers through free trade area development. These efforts have provided the world with opportunities in the Chinese market, investment in China, as well as in the service industry. Therefore, I think it's against the basic truth to refer to China as a closed and protectionist country. Generally speaking, I think China is much more open than developing countries like Indonesia and India.
The argument is that what China is doing is picking that aspect of globalization which benefits China, which is lack of tariffs. So because Chinese goods are more cost effective and they have advantages, and so that would benefit China. But there's other aspects of globalization too in terms of markets. So China has restrictions on what foreign entities can own in different industries. Finance industry, it used to be 33%, changes frequently, it's going up. The automobile industry, foreign companies have to have joint ventures, 50-50 joint ventures. And in many other industries, they've been restricted, they've been improving. But globalization in terms of openness is broader than just tariffs. So there are these questions about the openness of China's own markets in terms of the freedom to invest. And frankly, in recent times, as China is promoting globalization, we have the odd phenomena that the large majority of foreign companies work in China, both from the American Chamber of Commerce and the EU Chamber of Commerce, report statistically valid surveys that say that all the companies feel it's much harder to do business in China today than it was in the past.
I think we should look at this question dialectically. Objectively speaking, China's market has already emerged as the most competitive in the world. If we go back 10 or 20 years, there wasn't such a competitive domestic market with the presence of many foreign companies. But in recent years, with the rapid development of Chinese companies, be it SOEs or private ones, foreign companies can only survive if they provide goods or services of high quality. As for the restrictions you mentioned, say, restrictions for foreign companies in financial industries, they're not exclusive to China. If we look at the market in America, it's the same. Chinese state-owned companies, despite their competitiveness, face plenty of restrictions if they want to enter the American market. America treats domestic and foreign companies differently as well. A total of 87 Chinese SOEs and private companies have so far made their way to the Fortune 500 list. A few of them can enter the American market freely. So as a matter of fact, Both China and America work to promote bilateral trade and investment agreements. So it is the case between China and the EU. In this way, the two sides can stand on an equal footing and better promote market expansion featuring win-win and mutual benefits. China is an oriental giant, as we think, can walk better on two strong legs. On the one hand, we encourage capital. On the other, we help domestic companies to grow, SOEs and private companies in particular. Therefore, as we walk this way, we develop our own pattern of growth with our ongoing opening up. So foreign companies and domestic companies serve as two legs for our country, which together help our move forward. This is my summary of the lessons we learned over 40+ years of reform and opening up. So China, the oriental giant walking ahead with two strong legs, moves in a steadier and more sustainable way than if it just has one leg.
Mr. Tian, you have a comment?
补充一点就是，国际市场也应该看到中国的一些努力的一些方向。你比如说，一个最典型的就是中国的自贸。
I think the international community should better see the direction China is working toward. Most typically, the FTAs in China. At the start, China only had one FTA in Shanghai. Shortly after, there came up 3 more like Shenzhen and Zhuhai. This year, we added 7 more pilot zones. Some people compare our pattern of FTA development of 1+3 + 7 with that of one main body with 2 flanks, which expands the coverage of FTA to the original regional level Shanghai to the current extensive network linking eastern, central, and western China. Actually, the model has been set up on a national basis, which indicates the possible establishment of more and more FTAs and the environment encouraging foreign investment across the whole country in the future. I think this is good news to international investors.
Professor Hu, as China takes up the mantle of leadership, at least shared leadership, with globalization, responsibilities come along with that. What are some of the responsibilities that China is now assumed to carry that it didn't have the responsibility before?
也是有一个过程了，因为我们如果用贸易额。
Well, we've gone through a developmental process. If we look at China's ranking in the world market with its total trade volume, then in 1978, China ranked 29th. It was impossible for China to play any big roles. In 2000, China ranked 8th, not likely to play any significant role either. In 2013, China rose to number 1 in the world, and only then did we realize that we may have the capabilities to provide more public goods to the world. Therefore, China's ranking in the world signifies the transition it goes through from a marginalized country to the center of the world stage. Since President Xi Jinping took office, his visits to foreign countries and the times he attended international meetings have surged a lot, according to our calculation. Obviously, seeing is believing. By going out to different countries, China gains more in-depth understandings of them and makes better decisions to promote globalization. In this sense, the 2016 G20 summit in Hangzhou has witnessed the official China plan and accepted the plan referred to as a timely recipe against the general background of global recession. We hope that in the G20 summit in Germany this year and all the other G20 summits to come, China can continue to promote inclusive, invigorated, and sustainable green development of the world.
Ms. Tian, what are some of the new responsibilities that China must assume?
Personally, I understand the word responsibility from 2 perspectives. First, we can look at the responsibility China takes by looking at the transition of domestic development patterns in China. In the past, China developed quite rapidly, but also very extensively with little attention paid to sustainability of the development. But now, as China is going through its more weight has been accorded to a development path that is sustainable and green. This means China is now shouldering the responsibility to promote green and sustainable development of the economy. In the process, there will be many relevant policies. Say, in the 13th Five-Year Plan, green development is advocated one of the 5 major developments in China. Then, in terms of combating climate change, China makes its own commitment, which is also responsibility China takes for green and sustainable world development. Second, we can look at the responsibility China takes by reviewing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, a climax for Hangzhou G20 summit. Actually, for the conclusion of the 2016 Hangzhou G20 summit, China became the first country to put forth its national action plan. This has demonstrated China's wish to set up a role model for others and promote the global progress in implementing the 2030 Agenda.
Professor Hu, I want to be candid and tell you what policymakers and think tanks in the U.S., where I'm from obviously, tell me about China. Here's their concern in terms of China's assumption of leadership in globalization. Globalization per se and what China's doing in climate change and other areas is welcome by everyone. But here's the concern. It's coupled or married with two other factors. One is the perception that China has become more aggressive in its territorial disputes, particularly in the South China Sea with the claim of militarization. Second is the tightening of, shall we say, a political discourse within China on the internet and other places, that it is now tighter than it was before. So you have these two other factors, an apparent expansion in a militarization from their perspective, and a closed political discourse in China. And those two together with the globalization, which people by itself would welcome, gives people concern about what the future holds for a powerful and strong China. You've talked about China as a new kind of superpower. And so can you appreciate the sensitivity that people have to the rise of China given those factors?
我想呢，这个中国应当说进入到一个
I think today's China is in its golden era of development, which will create spread-over effects. So far, the biggest beneficiary is the ASEAN countries due to China's FTA with them. Actually, trade between China and ASEAN was quite limited about a decade ago, not even comparable to that between China and Japan. However, today, ASEAN has already become China's third largest trade partner, and China, ASEAN's first. Actually, China is the #1 trade partner, or biggest stakeholder country of ASEAN. Under these circumstances, we must consider the economic interests as we address issues concerning South China Sea. To a large extent, many stakeholders should take a reasonable attitude towards the economic interests and interests of other forums involved. We can feel that recently, leaders of the Philippines have already taken a positive response in cooperation. We know everyone is a stakeholder, China in particular, the biggest. Now there are already some basic measures to achieve the goal. As a matter of fact, China is not only the biggest trade partner for ASEAN, but also offers the largest scale of tourists and largest amount of investment to ASEAN countries. Therefore, with further globalization and ever-increasing closeness in between, I think the two parties can properly address the South China Sea disputes with reasonable stances. The second point I want to make is, despite the many voices out there condemning China as a closed country featuring one-party leadership and lack of transparency, my experiences tell a completely different story. We can look at the drafting process of the 13th five-year plan, for example. It actually showcases democratic development with unique Chinese characteristics. First, the drafting process features democracy as the State Council, the Central Committee, various democratic parties, and think tanks are all involved in the decision-making process. We, as the think tank, directly participate in the making of the decisions. Second, the process features professionalism, as there are a lot of systematic analysis that support the final decision. Looking to the Western countries, we actually find that they are in lack of such professionalism and planning. In China, if we want to set up a high-speed rail, there must be science-based analysis as a backup before actual. Opening up to the outside world is one of China's national policies, and China has reached its position as a superpower through continued openness. However, against the backdrop of globalization, we face different competitors. China is still a developing country and actually a latecomer in globalization. So how do we strike a balance? As a matter of fact, forwarded to a correct path, but also set up a good example to the world, particularly to the global south in terms of how they should seek development while opening their countries up. For instance, about more than 10 years ago, China gained accession to the WTO. Although we negotiated with the US for a certain treatment, the continuous opening up of the Chinese market, our competitiveness also increased. With this, we saw that the openness of China grows together with our domestic market. In this way, our opening up is highly sustainable and promises continuous progress. So it is highly necessary to strike a balance. But opening up takes time. Western countries have long assumed the role of professor to China, and China, the student. As a professor myself, I believe it should be the professor's goal to help the student become better than himself. As a matter of fact, China as a student has been catching up and is definitely going to outdo its professor. I hope Western countries should prepare for that.
It seems reassuring to see world leaders together in civil ceremony, as in the iconic photo of all the leaders lined up together. Much of the media focused on Trump, his handshake with Merkel, his meeting with Putin, the informal meeting between President Xi and Indian President Modi. The big story, though, is not a scoop. China's continuing emergence champions global governance. Many analysts recognize how China benefits an interconnected world. To make the story real, though, I explain how an interconnected world benefits China, such as new markets, economic diversification, natural resource access, political appreciation. I also ask, what new responsibilities must China assume? Is China ready to bear the burdens of, say, hotspot stability and international scrutiny? What about the openness of China's own markets? Does China preach one thing about protectionism and practice another? For China and according to China, what is the ideal balance between globalization and sovereignty? The answers I hear in public are not always the answers I'm told in private. Tracking each of these trends keeps us closer to China.